Hello, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, The Future of Ohio Shale Policy, Technology, and Economic Development. My name is Alyssa Welch, and I'm a project manager for the Ohio University Voinovich School of Leadership and Public Affairs. The Voinovich School, the Russ College, and the College of Arts and Sciences have been collaborating on this multidisciplinary project for the past 3 years in an effort to examine the impact of shale development on businesses and communities in Ohio's shale region. This project was supported by an Innovation Strategy Award from the Ohio University Research Division and produced the Shale Technology and Policy Symposium in 2017 and 2018. We are pleased to welcome our guest panelists as we offer this final webinar today to present some of the findings from this body of research. Just as a quick note as we begin, if you have a question for the moderator or the panelists during the webinar, please use your Zoom Q&A portal to send that question in. We will address as many questions as possible after the presentations have concluded. It's my pleasure to next introduce my colleague Mike Zimmer as moderator for this webinar. Mike's been associated with Ohio University as an executive in residence and senior fellow for almost 15 years. He holds a dual academic appointment with the Voinovich School as well as the Russ College. His training has been in political science, economics, law, and business, and his research contributions have guided Ohio R&D on state energy policy, state climate policy with Ohio State University, advanced manufacturing in Ohio, Ohio water policies, shale energy, economics and emissions, electric transmission distribution, clean energy, etc. He has served and advised the last 4 administrations in Ohio since Governor Taft, and also advised Senator Voinovich through his work at Ohio University. He is a former VP and Assistant General Counsel of the American Gas Association, who has spoken and written nationally for more than 40 years on topics of public policy and energy, environment, project finance, private partnerships, and legal and engineering ethics. His research has been shared in law, public administration, business, engineering, and environmental science fora since 1978. Mike, take it away.
Thank you, Alyssa, and good morning to our audience. In the next hour, we're going to go through our more formal presentations with our speakers, and we've reserved a period thereafter for questions and discussion with our audience before we proceed to a wrap-up and conclude this webinar at 1:30 this afternoon. I'm pleased to introduce our speakers, and I will do so in the audience in which they will present. Then I'll provide a brief introduction. Scott Miller is one of the principal investigators on the Ohio University Shale Grant over the past 3 years. Scott heads up the Russ College's work in this area, along with David Bayliss in the Russ College. And Scott serves as Associate Dean for Industry Partnerships for the Russ College at Ohio University. Scott's a longtime leader in Ohio energy matters over the past 20 years. And his work and focus on partnering and strengthens the Russ College research and technical collaboration with industry, with government, and the non-governmental organization sector. Our next speaker after Scott will be Matt Sobolski, the Director of Shale Energy and Petrochemicals for JobsOhio. Matt directly reports to Dana Saucier, Vice President and the Head of Economic Development for JobsOhio. Matt is a trained executive in master's degree recipient for public administration at West Virginia University with almost 15 years of economic development experience in the region. We're pleased to have Matt with us today. He's one of the oldest tenured officials in JobsOhio, serving the state as well as the region. Our third speaker will be David Nash, an energy and environmental lawyer for the past 30 years McMahon and DeGolis in Cleveland and their Columbus offices. Is a founder, along with Lisa Hong, of the Cleveland Area Corporate Sustainability Roundtable, which has served Cleveland as well as the region and state for over a decade of service. That group is focused on corporate sustainability as a matter of strategy, stewardship, and governance. David's experience that he will share today is in serving water districts with shale development in the state of Ohio. Our final speaker will be Dr. Daniel Carney. Dan is an assistant professor in the Department of Economics at OU, where he has taught, led research, and advised on this OU Shale grant. His focus has been on energy economics with analysis and community impact, export strategy for shale products, and regional financial implications of shale development. Dan's PhD was completed at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and he's worked before his service at Ohio University at ICF Consulting outside of Washington, D.C. In those capacities, Dan advised and provided energy economics guidance, aiding industry and federal departments and agencies. By way of brief introduction, we come together at a critical juncture as this research is completed. Ohio is now qualified as one of the top 10 states now for economic development, recently reporting this month, and first time in quite a while where Ohio has risen to that stature. Ohio's natural gas production, according to the Energy Information Administration, is up more than 28 times higher than when the shale development within the state commenced in 2010. Associated natural gas liquids are part of that evolving product capacity. We have 2 crackers in the region now in Pennsylvania, as well as proposed in Ohio. And DOE is working to propose an energy corridor in the tri-state area to provide durability resilience along with the Gulf Coast is a new emerging matter of national security. Ohio is the 8th largest producer state for ethanol, interestingly, supplying 550 million gallons per year. We also have diversified capacity as the 7th largest crude oil refiner in the country, with 4 refiners processing over 600,000 barrels a day of crude oil. We meet today, as well as the United Nations convenes in New York City in a commencement of a high-profile climate review to provide global guidance looking ahead. UN Chief Guterres has asked countries to plan further for reduced emissions in the future. Pledges are due by countries over the next year, and we're seeing increasing shift in global direction and development in the management of those critical questions looking ahead. Ohio comes back as the #1 producer of plastics and resin products in the polymer cluster that it manages in America, and is a worldwide leader in that space as well. 76 of 88 Ohio counties are at least managing one polymer facility or company in their county space with a skilled workforce in that sector of over 81,000 employees statewide. Polymers are a critical part of Ohio's economy on a going forward basis. And finally, I think we'll also see the growing recognition in some of the presentations shared today of the role of stewardship, governance, environmental, and circular economy implications ahead as the state works to nurture and capture the economic development opportunities that flourished since 2012, set the table more effectively for the upcoming decade of 2020 to 2030. With that introduction, I'm pleased to turn the speaker over to our first speaker, Scott Miller from the Russ College of Engineering and Technology.
Thank you, Mike. I appreciate that. And I'm going to try to attempt probably the most complicated thing I'm going to do all day, which is to take over control of screen and bring my presentation in. If I can get that. Share. Mike, can you confirm that you can see that?
Confirmed, Scott.
Confirm,
Thanks.
Scott.
I appreciate that and appreciate the introduction and appreciate Alyssa Welch for coordinating today's event. Want to just talk a little bit in preparation for my slide deck. We were talking before we joined the presentation today, the webinar today, that the shale oil and gas industry really began in earnest in the state of Ohio in 2010. So that's the line in the sand, and over the last 9 years, to quote the Grateful Dead, it's been a long and crazy trip, wild trip. We've moved from the development of upstream development with the drilling of the very first shale horizontal well in the state of Ohio in 2010. The exploration and production phase of this play has been borne out considerably. We have moved well into the midstream, the storage and transmission, and the development of an increased pipeline network throughout the region, and are moving aggressively now into downstream production with gas distribution, the oil refining, and as Mike mentioned, the petrochemicals and the plastics and the polymer industries, which will be the direct beneficiary of a lot of this work. The fundamentals, when we began here almost 10 years ago, were a little iffy, not knowing exactly what the reserves were in this region. The Appalachian Basin has some of the largest reserves for oil and natural gas in the world, and accessing them was a critical juncture. Since then, we've seen that the fundamentals of this industry have been borne out. Domestic natural gas production is up in the United States. Domestic natural gas liquids production is up. Domestic oil production is up. And as a result of all of that, we are at near historic lows for natural gas prices. Natural gas liquids and oil prices are stable. But all of this comes with some unquestionable impacts on local communities. There's volatility in this market. It is necessarily a volatile market. There are economic impacts throughout the region, but they're not evenly distributed. And so we need to keep an eye on these sorts of things. Workforce training and development, which is something I think we'll be touching on a couple of times today, is an issue, and how we can meet the industry's needs. And job growth is stratified. Not everybody's necessarily qualified or wants to work in this industry. This industry comes with some environmental impacts. The shale industry requires huge water loads, and how that water is accessed, where it comes from, how it will be cleaned and disposed and released back into our waterways is always a constant issue. And the ways which we can reduce that water input is extremely important. And then also, there are commensurate air quality issues. There are emissions issues that need to be tracked, and I will talk a little bit about some of those sorts of things. So these issues all come together, and Ohio University has been working on this issue for more than a decade now, working with our communities to try to understand the impact that this will have, both the positives and the negatives. And so with that, I'll launch into my slides. We came together, like I said, more than a decade ago, to try to figure out what the university could do to study and track the industry, and to try to make recommendations to improve the efficiency with which the industry operates, and try to figure out ways to take the most advantage that we possibly could. So we looked at that time across the university, and we found what I always refer to as pockets of excellence, folks that are interested in leaning forward on sort of these kinds of issues. Those folks were all over the campus, and in more than 5 different colleges and 13 different departments, focused on not just the engineering side where I reside these days, but also the economics and the economic development and the upside of the industry, as well as policy, and not necessarily policy development per se, but policy implementation. In other words, how how policies that are enacted, how they are enacted, and how they could be made policies could be used to improve the quality of life for folks in the industry and the communities in which we live. We began with a systems level approach. I'm just trying to really kind of take a design thinking approach to this. We sought to try to understand the oil and gas industry. We interfaced with industry members extensively for years and really tried to understand how this industry was going to expand in the region. We also brought with us, as the only major research institution in the Appalachian region, kind of an understanding of the communities in which we live. We want to make this work, and we want to make it work right and for the benefit of the region and the state and the nation. And we also looked at this to try to figure out how we could take help the communities, because this is transformative. This is once in a generation kind of economic development. And so, how can the communities adapt to and embrace this industry? Here at Ohio University, we brought all of those sorts of things together, and we have done studies on survey work. We have put together case studies. We have done business analyses. We have brought our considerable analytical laboratory equipment to bear on some of this work. We've done modeling. We've done data analytics. And so we brought all of that to bear over the course of the last 10 years. And I'm really pleased to say that we've got a sizable track record. And so the balance of my presentation today is going to be focused on work that is occurring here in the engineering college, the Russ College of Engineering and Technology. And I am going to present dangerously, I might add, the work of other people, but bear with me so I can share a little bit about the kinds of work that we're engaged in here at the Russ College. First, I'd like to share some work sponsored by the Department of Energy, the U.S. Department of Energy, by this is Dr. Jason Tremblay and the Institute for Sustainable Energy and the Environment. Jason and his team have been looking at ways to use solid oxide fuel cells to separate the core material that is pulled up after the hydraulic fracturing process, which is a mixture of molecules and useful and less useful constituents. Using SOFC, solid oxide fuel cells, Jason has been working to optimize the separation process and trying to figure out best ways to do so. He is also working on using those fuel cells that work is driving the selectivity and the conversion and the yields for the separation process that is coming out, that fractionation process at the wellhead, which is also leading to increased profitability for the potential profitability for those folks who want to use Jason's work. Jason is also engaged in work with the Utica Point Pleasant well geochemistry, trying to figure out ways to reduce the rust, ferrous and ferric oxide contamination on the inside of the wellbore. And so Jason is working to try to figure out ways and sampling and modeling and using some of the analytical equipment that he has in his lab to reduce the scaling on the inside of the wellbore that will increase the flow rates and the ability for material to come out. Let me move on very briefly to Dr. David Bayliss, who is also a full professor in the Institute for Sustainable Energy and the Environment. David is working on 3 separate projects that are all related to enhanced oil and oil recovery in the shale wells. The first is to understand both the solid and the fluid mechanics. So the pore spaces that are that inhibit or allow for the release of the gas and gas liquids and oil that are coming out of the wells. So he's doing modeling on both the internal and external forces and the connectivity between those pores. and he's also modeling to figure out what the increased product recovery would be under certain types of enhanced oil and gas recovery regimens. He's also doing work to model the recovery in the shale, understanding both the stimulation under a number of different stimulation techniques in the subsurface geology, as well as trying to figure out how to predict the performance under different stimulation techniques. And then finally, he's doing an economic modeling of that. If under these conditions, we can increase the pore spaces, increase the recovery of materials, then what are the economic benefits that matriculate out as a result of that? So just a couple of slides to demonstrate what David is up to. As I say, he is doing this work across a number of different shale basins. This is a modeling effort based upon the subsurface geology, the physical parameters, and the tight pore spaces in those shale formations, and understanding what's going on in those pore spaces under certain conditions under enhanced oil and gas recovery, and then trying to figure out what the increased productivity and product recovery rates would be. This is a chart showing, it may or may not show up well on your computers, that the green line is the oil produced under standard conditions. We all know that the fracturing process has an initial large output of oil and gas, and may require occasional re-stimulation of that well. And what his modeling shows is that over a period of time, the well performance doesn't sustain. And so the red line shows CO2 injection as a stimulus for enhanced oil and gas recovery. And what he's showing here is that under those conditions, the product is delivered in an increased fashion, and also then will also lead to the commensurate economic benefits, which is this slide showing that were we to continue to increase and stimulate wells over a certain period of time, the question is, at what point does the stimulation prove to be unsustainable and uneconomical? And that's the essence of what David is also trying to accomplish here and to model. We also have, and we're pleased to have here in the college, Dr. Kevin Crist, who operates our Center for Air Quality. Kevin was recently contracted through the Ohio Air Quality Development Authority to do an assessment of non-attainment regions in the state of Ohio. Those are areas, major metropolitan areas, primarily the Cincinnati area, the Columbus area, and the Cleveland metro area, that are always in danger. They're right borderline of becoming a non-attainment of air quality standards. And OAQDA was interested in modeling and understanding the impact that fuel switching from coal to natural gas would have on non-attainment in those areas. And they were particularly interested in constituents that were contributing to the development of ozone, low-level ozone in particular. And so Kevin and his team did a series of modeling runs to try to figure out what the impact from the fuel switching would be. So first and foremost, he was looking at conditions from 2011, which is right at the beginning of the shale industry, the development of the shale industry in the state, and then modeling out to 2023 and trying to figure out what the impact was going to be. So in the upper right-hand corner here, you can see the amount of both NOx and VOCs. These are constituents that contribute substantially to the development of ground-level ozone. And Kevin was looking at the emissions in the 300 tons per year of NOx and approximately 10,000 tons per year of VOCs in 2011. And through fugitive emissions and other sources, there's through Kevin's modeling, he is predicting a sizable jump in emissions of those two constituents in the region as a result of the shale industry. However, the other side of the coin is that the methane and the natural gas that is captured has contributed significantly to the fuel switching that is occurring at coal-fired power plants throughout the state. And so Kevin's modeling simulations have shown a commensurate decrease in NOx emissions based on fuel switching from coal to natural gas at electric generating units throughout the state of Ohio. And so on average, what Kevin is showing on the balance here between these two competing variables in his models is that he's got the delta average impact based on in 2023 of the oil and gas industry and electric generating units is using a mean average hourly ozone model, a significant increase in parts per billion of ground level ozone in non-attainment areas, specifically the Cincinnati area and a little bit more in Southeast Ohio. And so on balance here, the shale industry is having a direct positive impact on on conditions in the state of Ohio. And then finally, I'm just going to throw this out, and I think we'll talk a little bit more about this a little later on. But in terms of looking ahead, the question really becomes, as we look into our crystal ball, as we move into the development of the downstream operations, are we prepared as a state for the workforce that we hope will be materializing as a result of this industry? The question really always becomes, are folks like us here at the university lagging behind the industry, or are we able to kind of try to skate where the puck is headed and try to get out ahead of this? And so what I'm trying to demonstrate through this slide is that there are a number of folks out there, there are job seekers who are interested in getting into the industry. The industry is standing back saying we need qualified workers. And the question is, what kind of partnerships can we build as higher institutions of higher education, or even not higher education, career technical training programs, high school training programs, industry-led, on-the-job training. What sorts of training do we need to do to properly prepare the workforce to attract the companies here to take full advantage of this industry? And so we stand ready to work with folks like JobsOhio and the Department of Higher Education in doing that. And we're interested in leaning forward aggressively to understand better how we can craft those types of training programs to meet the needs of the future. So with that, I think I've exhausted my time limit, and want to turn the balance of the time back over to Mike and the rest of the team. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott, for that great summary review of OU's focus in this area over the past decade. Please turn the speaker over to our next speaker, Matt Sobolski, the Director of Shale Energy and Petrochemicals, who will speak to us the next 15 minutes on providing a sector update from JobsOhio's perspective. Matt, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Just want to confirm that everyone can see my slides.
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I do want to provide a brief overview of JobsOhio's history. I think some of the attendees on this webinar are familiar with us, but for those that aren't, JobsOhio was created in 2011 out of legislation to privatize the state of Ohio's economic development function. And in 2013, we secured a 25-year lease on the state's liquor franchise, which helps to fund our operations on an annual basis. It allows us a predictable funding stream to develop incentive programs, site redevelopment programs, workforce training, various levels of assistance for companies when we're helping them to either expand in Ohio or locate new operations in Ohio. I'll give you an example of how we used our flexible funding as it relates to the PTT ethane cracker over in Belmont County. I'll get into that a little bit later. Jobs Ohio today, it's very clear our vision, mission, vision is really to be the lead economic development company in the United States. We want to beat everybody out. We're climbing in the rankings. We still have a long way to go, and there's a lot of states that are stiff competition, but I think we're headed in the right direction. Our sole mission is to drive job creation and new capital investment through helping companies either locate new operations in Ohio or expand in Ohio. So we spend a lot of time on business retention, expansion efforts, as well as the attraction efforts. And here at Jobs Ohio, we've grown. Before today's webinar, we were talking just about 8 years ago, we had about 11 or 12 associates here at Jobs Ohio. Now we're up to about 90 people here in the office. We partner with 6 regional economic development entities throughout the state. Appalachian Partnership for Economic Growth is our partner in eastern and southeastern Ohio. And then our other 5 regional partners throughout the state. They're very critical to our success because we work on projects from the local level, regional, and state level, so kind of bottom up and top down when you look at state, regional, and local level. And these projects, in particular, shale energy and chemicals, are very complex when you're looking at downstream opportunities. So we need everybody to work very closely together. We do, this is just a map to show the 6 regional partners. Obviously, APEG is a very large region, and kind of the eastern portion, southeastern portion is very familiar with the shale development. Southern Ohio, maybe a little bit less on the upstream and midstream effects, but there are some downstream chemical entities located in Southern Ohio that we're trying to help maybe tie those into access to feedstocks, natural gas liquids to help them expand. So while there's different activity in different parts of the state and region, we're trying to bridge that gap and help companies not only throughout APEG, but throughout the state. Specifically to the energy and chemicals industry in Ohio, obviously a very large segment, about $43 billion in gross state product, around 90,000 employees directly related to the industry. Some of the major employers, Marathon being headquartered in Findlay, these are primarily headquarters operations. Sherwin-Williams, obviously chemical or coatings and paints fall into that, the Goodyear tire and rubber. So we've always had a large downstream petchem and converter industry. With shale development, we now have the upstream and midstream, which tells really a fully integrated story. So I'll get to that in a minute. This map is just a very high level example. This is not to be completely inclusive, but we use this map to communicate again, the upstream, midstream, and downstream presence that the industry has in Ohio. This map is also on our website, and it shows pipelines. It shows the various levels of wells that are either producing, drilled, or permitted by the circles, squares, and triangles in the eastern part of the state, and then the blue dots, chemical companies, and again, just an example, the refineries, power plants, which we need to update this to include a couple that are now under construction, and then the renewable piece. That's obviously a part of our energy sector within the state, so we do see the value in more renewable assets that are being developed in the state as well. Then, of course, the midstream assets, fractionators and processors in the red, and then kind of that maroon number 1 circle on the river is the proposed PTT De Lhommeethane Cracker. Something that was mentioned, I think, in the introduction, which was the federal government's interest in the Ohio, West Virginia, Pennsylvania region as part of national security when it comes to the energy and chemicals industry. You see the quote up at the top of the slide is from Rick Perry, Secretary of Energy and former governor of Texas, he made this comment last year. It was a few months after Hurricane Harvey hit the Houston area, and about 40% of the industry was shut down for about 2 weeks because of flooding as a result of the hurricane. And with all of the long-term vision and projections for natural gas liquids production in Marcellus, Utica region, the federal government certainly has its eye on our region to be a complementary hub to the Gulf. I don't think that we directly compete with them. We do compete with the Gulf on projects, but we can very much complement the area as opposed to be a true direct competitor to the Gulf. This slide is just meant to summarize. This data is as of September 10th, so a couple of weeks old. But we have over 3,100 wells permitted, 2,600 drilled, and 2,300 in production. We started at JobsOhio, we entered into an agreement with Cleveland State University a few years ago to track the direct private investment related to this sector, really upstream and midstream first, to try to capture what has happened in Ohio since 2011. The first shale well in Ohio was drilled in 2010, but 2011 really started to take off. And through June of 2018, we're finishing up the next update on the study. We've tracked 74 billion, and that's just in Ohio. That does not include Pennsylvania, West Virginia. We're very proud of that because it shows the build out of the sector, but it also shows when we're talking to companies that don't have a presence in Ohio or even in the US, we show that 74 billion number in a short period of time, and it's an example of what a good place Ohio is to deploy capital. So that's very important. Some of our other main points of focus, we are trying to add more downstream projects, whether it's existing chemical companies that need to expand, bringing new developments like the cracker to Ohio. We're also working across industry sectors. So we've got all this cheap natural gas in Eastern Ohio. How do we get it to other parts of the state to help manufacturers of all different products to take advantage of cheap natural gas, those that use a lot of gas in their production. So we're very focused on that. We work with our colleagues on the advanced manufacturing side and other sectors to try to help for those new projects. We're seeing more gas-fired power plants being built or come online. And then we also interface with all of our state agency partners, EPA, ODOT, et cetera. We can't win these large projects without their cooperation. And while JobsOhio is a private entity, we still work very closely with our regulatory agency partners. The next two slides are meant to show just the large change in the energy and chemicals sector since 2011. So the white space and the blue headings are areas for opportunity. This could be looked at 2010 in Ohio. We've always had the downstream, we've had the refiners. You look at it now, the upstream, midstream's been built out. We're getting more downstream opportunities, more power generation. And so we're able to tell companies what a good opportunity it is to, as our partners at the Shale Crescent USA say, produce it here, process it here, and then build the downstream plants, and then you have the access to market to distribute the final product. Some of the companies we're talking to are going to export some product, but being in the Midwest, there's significant cost advantage. A couple of things. The workforce piece is obviously extremely complicated, and it's going to take a lot of work from a lot of different entities. I think Scott's last slide summed it up well, that you've got a lot of universities, you have technical schools, you have the high school system. We have kind of a revitalized, resurgent industry in terms of the chemical operators and those types of skill sets. So we do have a good base. This slide shows kind of the construction workers and their wages from kind of the center of the graph on left, and then from center on right is more of the operations. So we have a good story to tell in terms of our workforce being a little bit more cost advantaged than national averages. And we've seen an increase in more chemistry, chemical process technology at the, again, from the university level on down to technical schools, trying to take advantage of this resurgent industry. And then on the construction side, one of the key pieces that we hear from companies is, do we have the ability to build large scale plants? Us being a traditionally industrial state, we have a lot of good examples of that. Most recently, some large pipeline projects, but we have large manufacturing facilities throughout the state that have been built. We also have on the chemical side, the Shale cracker that's being built in Monaca, Pennsylvania. All indications from Bechtel right now are very positive in terms of construction. So construction is a significant piece, but then the ongoing operation. So I know JobsOhio is working with Department of Jobs and Family Services, Department of Higher Ed, and other groups to really kind of work much more closely than what we have in the past, because we see this trend heading in the right direction in terms of us needing to have our act together on workforce. Very briefly, I want to mention the PTT project. I know folks are on here that are interested to hear what's been going on. Quick timeline, we've been engaged on the project since the summer of 2013. We actually worked with PTT. We didn't realize it back in 2012. They have a joint venture partner project down in Cincinnati that we helped them expand that facility. But really since 2013, we've been close partners with them. We identified sites. We've helped clean up the site that they now own along the Ohio River. We've worked on workforce. We've done a number of things. We've partnered with the Ohio EPA, Department of Natural Resources, to get all of the permits in place. This project would obviously take natural gas liquids that's being produced in the region within about 70 miles of the Shale cracker that's currently under construction. So we're certainly excited about that. We want to see as much liquids and natural gas that's being produced in the region stay in the region. Just a few pictures. Back in 2009, on the map on the bottom of the slide, the bluish purple is the former power plant site that First Energy Solutions owned. That plant was shuttered in 2010. And then the red portion of the property on the bottom was owned by a private landowner, business partners. In total, the site's about 500 acres. And we worked with the two property owners prior to PTT acquiring the site. We worked with them to demolish the plant, remediate the site. That way, once they make a final investment decision, they can begin construction. This project published reports are about $8 billion of investment. So obviously a very significant investment. 6,000 or more construction jobs at peak, and then hundreds of really good high-paying jobs to operate the plant. I mentioned how closely we've worked with the company. We've spent about $19 million preparing the site. Back in July, we secured another $30 million to help go to site prep that is begun back in August. December 21st of 2018, they received their air permit, which was the final permit. And again, we just worked very closely with EPA, DNR, Army Corps of Engineers to be a full service partner for the PTT project. And then back in May, their leadership was here, met with Governor DeWine, Lieutenant Governor Husted. A couple days later, they were in Washington, D.C., because a project of this magnitude is obviously important at the federal level, having federal support. I think we'll have some questions later, maybe on some of the tariffs and things like that. So they've been paying a lot of attention to the project in Washington, D.C., and that certainly, I think, will bode well to getting us to a final investment decision. So quite a bit of information that I wanted to fly through, and that concludes my comments.
Matt, thank you very much. Your presentation fits very logically with the initial foundation laid by Scott. We're pleased to transition to our next speaker, then David Nash. David, I've had the privilege to work with both nationally as well as regionally and in the state of Ohio for the past 15 years. David will share his insights on his work, particularly in the water space and the way water is being managed within the state, and also maybe some other comments on issues related to stewardship and sustainability in the mid to long term. David, thank you for being with us. The floor is now yours.
Hi, everybody. I hope you can hear me. My screen just disappeared, so I'm not sure I can put up my slides.
Dave, this is Alyssa. Excuse me. Would you like me to run your slides for you?
Please do.
Okay, give me one moment, please.
They're now up, David.
Thank you. One moment.
Great. I see it at least a little bit. Here we go. Hang on. Oh, got it. Screen's back. Thank you. So my name is Dave Nash. I'm a partner in the law firm of McMahon DeGullis with offices in Cleveland, Columbus. We do work around the state, around the country. We're the largest firm in Ohio that concentrates its practice in environmental law and related litigation. And I also have sort of a unique perspective, not just in terms of regulation and negotiating energy contracts, including oil and gas leases. But as Mike said at the outset, I've been working on sustainable economy and the business case for sustainability civically as a tool for economic development for the last 15, 16 years. And so what I'm going to talk about is a case study entitled "The Future of Ohio Shale Energy is Good If Ohio Does Shale Energy Well." And the rationale behind that title is one of the main premises around sustainability is that if one does good, one can do well at the same time. It might sound trite, but it's a primary motivator for sustainable business and economy, and it is certainly true for the shale energy industry in Ohio. We were also very lucky since 2011 to be engaged by the Muskingum Watershed Conservancy District as counsel to help formulate their shale energy program. And it's been a remarkable case study. The district covers almost 20% of the state of Ohio and is frankly the largest landowner in the state of Ohio. It, of course, has an environmental stewardship mission. Its main mission is to do flood control in the Muskingum River watershed leading into the Ohio River, to do conservation around water resources in the watershed, and to provide recreation opportunities around some of its 14 lakes and reservoirs, which are also managed in partnership with the Army Corps of Engineers, who operates various dams for those lakes and reservoirs. So the first issue we were asked to look at is, should the district even participate in this industry? And we did a preliminary basic sustainability life cycle analysis. We looked at all the environmental inputs and outputs. We looked at all the social inputs and outputs. We looked at all the economic inputs and outputs. The environmental inputs and outputs in particular were around air emissions, including greenhouse gas emissions and methane emissions. We looked at water issues, of course, given the mission of the district as a conservancy district created by law in the state of Ohio. And we looked at all the social inputs and outputs in terms of how would this affect the district stakeholders, community residents within the district, users of the recreation facilities, and in particular, what would be the environmental consequences. Alyssa, I think let's go to slide 3, actually, if we can. So, triple bottom line of sustainability, again, economic, social, environmental. When we first started working with the district and they asked the question, should we partner with industry to use our mineral resources and add on to the traditional oil and gas program already extant in the district since the 1930s. We were told that at the time the district had an $80 million deferred maintenance deficit, and that the allowed tax assessments within the district to fund district activities were not sufficient to fund the district's mission. And long story short, the district did decide to engage with industry partners and participate in shale energy development. And so that $80 million deferred maintenance deficit swung to over a $160 million surplus for recreation and conservation projects within that 18-county area to date. Next slide, Alyssa, please. Of course, legal documents are near and dear to my heart as a lawyer, and so we helped the district negotiate best management practice and model oil and gas leases covering approximately 20,000 acres over 6 different tracts. And one of the key tools for these leases is that, of course, there is primarily state regulation of this industry with some federal overlap through FERC, the Federal Energy Regulation Commission. But what we did in concert with both district personnel and petroleum engineering experts, primarily from Marietta College, we developed a structure of private environmental protection best management practices that went significantly above and beyond regulatory minimums in the leases we negotiated with our partners. And of course, we had leverage to negotiate with our partners for 2 reasons. One, we had substantial acreage right in the heart of Ohio shale country. And 2, with both our legal experience and our industry experience from Marietta College and the district's own staff with its own oil and gas program, we knew what was possible within the industry. And we made the decision in our sustainability analysis that the question is not whether hydraulic fracturing in shale can be done well. The question is, will it be done well? And the district set about to do it very well through these mechanisms in the lease that we helped incorporate into the transactions with our industry partners. In terms of social values and costs, next slide, Alyssa, please. What you see in this slide is a photo of what they call the Zoar levee. near I-77 in Navarre and Zorro, Ohio. And this is just one example of some of the flood protection mechanisms that Muskingum, again, in concert with the Army Corps of Engineers, own, build, and operate for flood protection for both natural and the built environment. And it literally has saved the village of Zorro, which is a historic village in Ohio, from excess flooding from the Tuscaroras River. And you can see in the photo the levee there. Also, the district directly employs about 300 people throughout the year. It's based in New Philadelphia. The district estimates that 5.5 million visitors per year take advantage of district recreation facilities, natural facilities, campgrounds, lakes, cottages, marinas, fishing areas, trails, you name it. So again, when we looked at this, once we decided that the industry could do its job well and do it consistent with the stewardship mission of the district, we decided to proceed and go ahead with these oil and gas leases with our industry partners. Next slide, please. We mentioned some of these points previously. Again, we had negotiating leverage, which enabled us to get concessions from industry partners and build this secondary environmental regulatory and protection mechanism into our leases. Of course, we had great technical expertise to help structure those leases. And some elements of those leases that I'd like to share with you, unlike many traditional oil and gas leases, as owner of the property, landlord, so to speak, with the industry partners as tenants, we had significant development oversight over the design, location, placement of any facilities. We had extensive provisions dealing with protecting both existing water resources and protecting the environment from wastewater production during the drilling and production of oil and gas from these rigs. Buffers from sensitive environmental or community resources. The leases also are not static since they're relatively long term. As state-of-the-art technology for environmental protection increases, so do the requirements under our leases with our industry partners. And of course, we have comprehensive ability under these leases to audit and inspect not only the facilities, but the books and operations of our industry partners. So in brief, to date, from 2011 to 2019, I think it's safe to say that my friends in New Philadelphia within the Muskingum Watershed Conservancy District have had a positive experience so far, economically, socially, and environmentally. And particularly for residents and communities in Southeast Ohio, not only has this been an economic boon, it's been a cultural boon, and I'll share just one story supporting our conclusion that doing shale well development means doing Ohio good. I attended a public meeting down in Guernsey County, and it was very well attended at the Elks Lodge there, and the issue was, should the district enter into an oil and gas lease with a specific industry partner in that particular neck of the woods. And of course, we had various opinions expressed. Some of the district stakeholders, in fact, cottage owners in particular, questioned whether the industry could be done in an environmentally responsible way, and was back and forth. Sometimes the discussion was relatively heated. And at the very end, the custodian for the Elks Lodge, who had remained silent and sort of in the background, taking care of the facility and even sweeping up after some of the attendees at the meeting, spoke up and said, "I'd like to say something." And what he had to say is he said, "Look, we trust the district to protect the environment. But I will tell you that in my community, engaging with this industry has meant that some of my neighbors and family members can now own their own houses when before all they had were mobile homes." And to me, that was the deciding factor, he said, to this group of public considering the pros and cons of this industry. And it's a point very well taken. The industry is very, very important to the residents of Southeast Ohio. And in addition to all the good recreation, conservation, and things like that, basically it comes down to whether this industry is good for people. And so far it seems to have been very good. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David, for the insights and the practical experiences and case studies you've shared. Our final presenter before we move into about 20 minutes of discussion and questions and answers, and please file any questions you may have with our site. Our final presenter is Dr. Daniel Carney from the Department of Economics at Ohio University. Dan, the floor is now yours.
All right, great. Thank you very much. Thanks everyone for being here. So I'm going to just talk about some of the outcomes from the Shale Innovation Grant that's kind of over the past few years. So Scott began with some discussion of research that has happened at the Russ College. I'm going to discuss some other outcomes at Ohio University with regards to shale. In particular, in 2016, the research office began an innovation strategy initiative, so to increase the university's profile in the shale area. And the name of the grant that ended up coming out of this process was Fronting a Bust, Innovations for Sustainable and Enhanced Economic Outcomes from Shale. The goal was to increase regional economic development and wealth, enhance energy security, and mitigate the societal and pollution-related impacts of the pending shale industry potential bust. And we'll put that bust in quotes here. And the idea here was to note that, there's been a lot of growth. We've seen a lot of, large industries in the past in this area, and just try to think about those things in terms of these economic cycles on this longer term basis. As Matt noted, we are definitely in the state of Ohio trying to build downstream capacity as well as our upstream capacity. As Dave just noted, doing well and doing good. So while the name of the grant has this kind of bust piece in it, I think we shouldn't emphasize the boom part and then think about mitigating a potential bust. As Scott talked about earlier, we have lots of different folks working on this grant. In particular, a lot of names that you heard from the Russ Engineering College, Professor Bayliss, Professor Crist, etc. So the goal here is just to provide a brief overview of some of the findings and resources developed during the past few years from the particular grant. There are a bunch of links below. We'll have them available. And I just took a select list of deliverables and tried to share the results here to give a flavor of what we've been working on. Obviously, I can't go into everything. There's so much stuff, but this is just to give you a taste of what we've been doing here. Okay, so I will go into even less detail than Scott about the engineering piece. So here are the particular engineering pieces that were supported by the grant. I would note the enhanced shale conductivity from Drs. Bayliss and Reza. I happened to see a presentation on this. Very cool, very foundational work with how to basically get more bang for your buck, right? So we know that there's fracking going on. How do you try and as long as you're going to have this fracking activity, how do you get the most natural gas and natural gas liquids out of those wells? But lots of other things going on as well, including the remote sensing that Dr. Crist has been doing. In this boom bust framework, we did a bunch of different framing activities kind of at the beginning of the grant to get a sense of this kind of potential boom bust framework, to think about, the coal industry in the past, potential iron and steel industry in the past, and trying to learn from lessons so that we can say, okay, we're going to have this great shale and fracking development, and how do we make sure that we both build up the downstreams and do well while we're doing good. And so this is just a framework piece that we had built. So a colleague of ours, Jonathan Norris, wrote a piece managing the boom bust. What can shale communities learn from the coal booms and busts in Central Appalachia? So he did a kind of historical look back at those other resource systems. He also wrote some other framing documents as well. So Jonathan was very prolific in writing some resources here. So governing public infrastructure in Ohio shale play, impacts and management. So he actually talked to 7 different municipal officials and asked them about the impacts in their counties with respect to oil and gas industry, as well as strategies they employed to manage these. One of the particular ones would be traffic in the early years, for instance. But also was to do with the additional tax revenue. So it's one of those things where you now have a bunch of tax revenue, you have to decide, what to do with it. And that can be its own problem. Beyond shale, building resiliency in Ohio's workforce. So Matt talked about this. So the workforce is certainly very important, and building that human capital. So not just having kind of a worker, but a worker with skills, and a worker that is transferable, and a worker that has their own human capital wealth that they can use to build upon in their lifetime. So I know that Jonathan definitely used some resources from JobsOhio, as well as other resources to talk about building resiliency in Ohio's workforce. Our group did a community impact survey. So in 2016, we reached out to many local stakeholders, mayors, township officials, county level folks, talking about what are the biggest impacts, good and bad, from shale development in their areas, and we were able to distinguish or ask them about the different types of impacts. So we call this primary, secondary, and indirect. Just that was the nomenclature we used for our survey, because we were asking people who weren't sector experts, and thinking about what are the pros and cons. So these are just different categories about what are the biggest things that you see changing as a result of shale. Obviously, this is just their perceived opinions, but in the second column of the table there, that is the percent of respondents that said things were going, that there was an increase in this category. So we see things like traffic congestion and rental housing prices were up. We also see economic growth, citizen wealth, and local tax revenue up. So this goes back to Dave's a story about the guy saying, "Hey, my friends can now own their own land," right? So we see that reflected in the survey results as well. One of our colleagues, Professor Shode, did an economic impact analysis of the shale industry cluster using InPlan, which is a very detailed economic model. Basically, he found in 2015, shale contributed to a little over $22 billion of economic activity in the shale impacted counties, as defined by those having wells. Obviously, that's not all of it, but that's the area for study. A lot of that, this is both primary and all of the multipliers and all of the secondary impacts altogether. And we saw, over $22 billion a year, so that's a pretty big number. This kind of goes back to Matt's number of 74 billion, so in the same double-digit billions, different sample area, but kind of same order of magnitude. Another project I looked at with Jonathan Norris was project level data using a inventory that Bricker and Eckler had put together. It found that between 2010 and 2015, there were $24 billion of listed project investments alone. So that's just capital building. So that's, again, similar order of magnitude there. And 63% of the counties with project listed in the database had no oil or gas well permits approved prior to 2010. So these are projects that were related to oil and gas development. So we see the kind of new economic development as an impact from shale. So places that did not have energy projects before now have energy projects. And so that, again, is confirming that change. Then Mr. Zimmer and I worked on a white paper trying to think a little bit more about what happens to prices in our area and prices in the basin in general as we build out natural gas pipelines, both connecting our region in greater capacity to the outside region. So the graph, this is motivated by the graph on the right. Basically, this shows the price differential from natural gas in Ohio and surrounding states versus the rest of the nation. So before 2010, our prices were higher, right? And now we've had a big increase in supply, so our prices relatively have gone down. So this is controlling for the overall level of prices. And Mr. Zimmer and I started to think about what happens to prices as we become more interconnected with the outside region. And there's some interesting economics that go on. In particular, as we become more interconnected in the world market, because natural gas is a standardized commodity, then we would tend to expect our prices to move towards the world or national averages net of the transportation costs. And there's some interesting implications of that. All right. So I just wanted to provide some overview of just some very brief overview of the resources and findings here at Ohio University as a result of this particular shale-focused grant that Scott talked about and Melissa introduced. There are links provided below. If you need or want any particular information, feel free to reach out to any of us here at Ohio University who've been on this webinar, and we can help direct you to those resources. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you to all our panelists for their formal presentations and remarks shared with our audience. We have some questions that have come in, and why don't we start with an initial question, maybe building on the last two presentations around community. The first question might be, how are Ohio communities planning ahead in terms of having the tools, the funding, and the budget support to meet the challenges of the next stage of shale development in the upcoming decade of 2020 to 2030? What's going well? What other tools may they need looking ahead? Dan, David, and perhaps Matt, you may want to comment as well.
This is Matt. Maybe I'll give my perspective, and it's an impact on budgets and resources. But what we're trying to work on with our regional and local partners is having more sites that are ready to be developed to accommodate for additional downstream investment. Not every project is going to be a multi-billion-dollar, 500-acre plus ethane cracker. There's going to be a lot of other smaller ancillary projects, but have a good long-term positive economic impact. So we're trying to work with our partners to identify sites that work that can accommodate various types of facilities, whether it's a small petrochemical plant or a converter, something like that. So really having the communities know their sites, know what their educational workforce resources are, being prepared that way. We see that as having the biggest impact. That way they're ready when we bring them opportunities.
Thank you, Matt. Any other panelists want to add to that comment regarding the question on our communities and how they're faring?
Hey, this is Dan Kearney. I would just note that we had a lot of interaction with local officials through our surveys and the interviews that Jonathan conducted. One of the things that kind of came away, it's not necessarily in the data, but just that this is kind of like a big thing, and they sometimes needed some capacity building in terms of their own governance with how to deal with the new scale of budgets and documents and all of these things that just had not been in there before. So that was one thing that kind of came up as more of an anecdote rather than a piece of data.
Let's switch. Next question. We're seeing trade policy initiatives emerging at the federal level over the past 2 years. Any sense of how they're impacting our market opportunities for shale product and downstream market developments ahead? And how does this relate to some of the emerging international development interest we've seen on the production side, and perhaps may anticipate on the downstream side? Matt, you want to kick off any comments on that question?
Sure. Related specifically, I'll just use the PTT De Lhommeethane Cracker as an example. The companies have met multiple times with Secretary Ross and his team at Department of Commerce, and it appears that certain, I would maybe call them friendly companies, countries to the federal government, are likely to get exemptions for certain tariffs. I believe that the Shale project in Monaca, Pennsylvania received some tariff exemptions on the equipment that they'll be bringing in as prefabricated. So something very similar on the PTT De Lhommeethane side. But we do see projects across industry sectors here at JobsOhio that may have been closer to the finish line, and companies have kind of pressed pause to understand what the impact may be on their business, depending on where their company is based, where they're headquartered, or where they'll source materials or equipment. So we've seen some uncertainty play out, and that's caused some companies to slow some decisions down.
This is Professor Kearney. I would just say, indeed, in a more general sense, the potential use of, or the shifting from a exclusively free trade tariffless environment to the potential prospect of tariffs in the future and or going forward, that adds, of course, more risk and uncertainty to the market. It basically creates a larger, you need more margin on your product. So all else equal, you'll likely to see fewer projects be started, right? So if you need to invest in a large, let's say LNG facility now, and there might be tariffs in 5 years after you complete, that's going to make you think twice about whether to start the project today.
Let me move to the next question that has come in. One of the members of our audience was citing their personal experience visiting the Antero fracking site and our neighbors in West Virginia. At that site, he noted that they were showcasing a state-of-the-art wastewater processing and recycling plant that seemed quite impressive from a technical and operating perspective. The question is anything like this happening or appearing in Ohio as part of a future strategy to manage and address and be good stewards on environmental and water impacts looking ahead? Dave Nash or Scott, you may want to comment.
Sure, be glad to. Thanks for that question from our participant. The answer is, the short answer and the technical legal answer is yes, but I don't know for sure. All I know is that in the district, there is no water that sits in open impoundments or is exposed in any way to the environment once it comes back out the well. Now, whether the state of the ART facility in West Virginia that our participant visited has been duplicated in Ohio, I don't know. Antero is one of the district's industry partners, so I have to believe that the technology that is being used in West Virginia will be used in Ohio as well. Scott, do you have any information about other facilities in Ohio?
Not specifically, David, but I would say that the industry recognizes that, I think as I mentioned, that it has a huge water burden, and using fresh water for the hydraulic fracturing process is proven to be extremely costly, and also it has a kind of a really negative effect on the operations. It's really kind of a bit of an Achilles heel for the industry. There have been numerous studies self-financed by the industry, by a variety of folks in upstream operations, to try to figure out ways to substitute for water, whether it's the use of different types of foams and also different type of proppant material in the fracturing process that will help alleviate the need to use quite as much water. Of course, in areas that aren't as water rich as the state of Ohio is, and the Appalachian Basin is, folks, for instance, in the Eagle Ford in western Texas have looked at all sorts of different types of opportunities to reduce their water burden. I will say that this is an area where we have been exploring quite aggressively here at the Russ College, and Dr. Tremblay, who I mentioned before, is the director of our Institute for Sustainable Energy and the Environment, has been working on technology. I don't know if it is his technology that Antero is using or not, but his technology would be truck-mounted, field deployable, and located at the wellhead that would recycle waste water from the fracturing process right at the wellhead, which would reduce the need to bring in fresh water to replace and significantly potentially reduce the cost of operations at the wellhead. So it is something that we have been exploring, and the industry is always looking for alternatives in this area, because it is quite costly and time consuming for them to bring this in.
That's a great point, Scott. If I can just address that a little bit from my experience with Muskingum. First, the burden is significant, and industry is working hard to reduce the amount of water it uses, either through recycling technologies or through substitutes like gels or foams or even propanes. Because the facts are, when you inject, each fracking well on average uses between 1 and 2 million gallons of water to open up the fractures that allow the oil and gas to come out. And typically between 25 and 40% of that water can be recovered, cleaned up, and reused at most. Some of it just stays down there in the deep geological formations. So you do have to analyze the water cycle in the particular region very carefully. And as you pointed out, our Appalachian region is blessed with abundant water compared to some other areas where this industry is really taking off, like the Permian Basin in Texas or the Bakken fields in North Dakota and things like that. A little perspective is also required. During our sustainability analysis, we used a technique called dilemma sharing to try to balance the competing environmental, social, and economic values and costs that we were trying to optimize in determining, whether we should participate and how we should participate in this industry. And first, just in terms of facts, as part of its flood control mission, the district every November and December sends about 10 to 12 billion with a B gallons of water from its reservoirs and lakes down the watershed to the Ohio River and onto the Gulf of Mexico to reduce the water in its reservoirs in anticipation of winter rain and snow and then spring melt to fulfill its flood protection mission. Now, 1 million to 2 million gallons used by each well sounds like a lot, but it's only 1/10,000th of what the district sends back into Ohio streams at the end of each season. So there is plenty of water for industry and for communities alike. The possibility for water shortages in this region is only theoretical and not practical. One of the second things I've learned is that you mentioned that bringing trucks onto the well site with recycling equipment, tanks, things like that. One of the things the industry has done judiciously is enter into temporary water supply contracts with its industry partners from its lakes and reservoirs. And what the district has found is that the potential environmental impacts of using water for the wells is greatly reduced by engaging the industry in this fashion. Otherwise, it has to be trucked or piped in. And frankly, the amount of trucks that would have to be brought in to supply that amount of water would create a traffic nightmare. And so the district has reduced air pollution, reduced road safety hazards, noise, dust, you name it, by entering into these judicious contracts with its industry partners, which also have its own environmental protections, limitations, things like that. I did not negotiate those water supply contracts. Others on the Muskingum team did, but they went through similar sustainability analyses as with the oil and gas contracts themselves.
Here's another question. Thank you for that discussion. Are panelists aware of studies that have been made on human health impacts with the shale progress to date, including long-term impacts of volatile organic compounds as the downstream development process increases? I'll start. I know that there have been increasing studies done in the human health space appearing now in Pennsylvania with their deeper and maybe longer standing experience with the Marcellus Shale development there. We've also seen some work in that space in Colorado that has appeared, and then more recently some increasing sensitivity and input on that question appearing also in Wyoming and New Mexico. Any of our other panelists want to speak to that question?
If not, I could comment on it a little bit, Mike. Of course, the lawyer who doesn't get paid by the word has to weigh in here. Just very briefly, there have been many, many studies that have looked at different exposure scenarios, either to methane or groundwater in regions where this industry takes place. And again, the story is if the projects are done right and done well, there is very little health risk, let alone environmental risk. A lot of the stories that came out of the early drilling projects in the Pennsylvania Marcellus in particular, and some of the West Virginia projects were not done well. And what you saw in terms of maybe media or films or documentaries of people turning on their kitchen faucet and being able to ignite their kitchen faucet because there's gas coming out of their drinking well and their plumbing, exposure to contaminated groundwater, exposure to methane, were all caused by operational defects. In the wells, they were drilled, the casings were not done right. There was cross-contamination from the product they were trying to bring up from the deeper formation in the Marcellus, in the intermediate and shallower geologic formations where the drinking water wells were sited. And my sense is, of course, the industry is not perfect. There is a lot of reason to criticize, for many reasons, the oil and gas industry, and to get them to do even better than they are already in terms of human and environmental health protection. But a lot of those early horror stories have gone away for the most part as both regulation, knowledge, and engineering practices have improved.
Thank you for that input. Let's go around for a final question of each panelist. In listening today, as well as your work in the field and with our collective experience together, as Ohio looks ahead for the next phase of development in this critical period of 2020-2030, what one recommendation or policy might you suggest or change or amend to focus and improve upon the shale development market opportunity for the state in this upcoming decade? Scott, you want to start a brief response?
Sure, I'll give you three quick ones, Mike. One would be try to figure out if the state of Ohio and the United States could try to figure out how to increase foreign direct investment. We're seeing the significant potential investment with an MOU with China in West Virginia. We're seeing a lot of investment from foreign countries in this space specifically, obviously related to energy security for their own needs. So if we can kind of move that in that direction, that would be great. A second one would be the development of something akin to developing some sort of sovereign wealth fund, some way to capture and trap that in the revenues that are generated through this work. There needs to be a lot of work done in this area, I believe, and that's probably directly attributable to a lot of potential work going forward. And then the third, in my opinion, would be in the state of Ohio, we have a very unique fund that is potentially worthy of re-engaging, and that's the Third Frontier Fund for the development of technologies that could significantly improve conditions both in the oil and gas industry and other industries as well. And research institutions are keen on making sure that that is re-institutionalized in the state and try to figure out a way to keep that going. So those are three potential policies that I would throw out there for consideration.
Great input. Matt, your quick thoughts, comment, and conclusion.
I'd like to see a better plan statewide around infrastructure expansion, site preparation, more on the speculative side. There's only so much money to go around, but if there was kind of a common plan to develop and extend infrastructure to areas that don't have it, maybe flatten some more sites, get them ready, that would be ideal.
Building off of the great partnership that laid the foundation for the PTT project and location and remediating the old First Energy site.
Yes.
Next, David, your one or two quick thoughts.
Sure, just very briefly, what's the long-term future of Ohio shale? And it has to do in terms of not only can the industry be done well right now, but where does natural gas and oil from shale fit into the longer-term global economy? And from a sustainability point of view, there are issues, especially with the new focus, I should say relatively new focus on pollution by plastics, the difficulty of recycling plastics, both technically and from a market point of view. What is the future of petrochemicals in this country and the world? And the fact that we live, essentially, we need to move towards a circular economy because we live in a closed loop planetary system. So this is just my own personal view. Shale is necessary, in my view, probably for the next several decades at least, if not for the longer term, simply because the work I've done in other renewable energy projects, advanced energy projects, technologies, indicate that there still has to be a transition period of those technologies and those projects and operational histories, at least to scale them up to utility scale. We can't immediately switch to solar, wind, fuel cell technology and things like that, although the advances, both economically and environmentally, for those industries are really gaining ground. So natural gas, when it's viewed as a bridge fuel to the future, I think is a very, very necessary part of our both federal and state policy. With respect to plastics, that's a harder thing. It is really difficult to see photos of some of our waterways and oceans around the world and all the trash that gets put in there. On the other hand, if we did not have these high-tech plastic materials, both human health and environmental protection would not be as advanced as it is now. So I think it's incumbent upon human behavior and being educated in our choices as consumers. What are the consequences of those choices to essentially improve the way plastics or petrochemicals are used as opposed to banning them outright? So thanks for listening. I'm done.
Dan, the final word is yours.
All right. First one would be a general comment in terms of supporting workforce development through education in the state of Ohio. So making sure we have good educated workers that are capable of earning good incomes and wealth. And then a more kind of practical policy would be making sure that local and regional governmental agencies have the capacity to interact with this new large industry in terms of just good governance, the scale of their business. I mentioned this kind of before, but I want to reiterate that again.
Thank you to each and every one of our speakers today, and thank you to our audience. I know in our work at Ohio University, we have a separate work underway for almost 8 years now at the Portsmouth port site on a contract with the Department of Energy. And a lot of what we've discussed here today has been discussed as part of an emerging reindustrialization project at that site that might serve as a critical laboratory for the pursuit demonstration of a lot of what we've discussed today to benefit both that region in Ohio as well as the multi-state region, including West Virginia and Pennsylvania and Kentucky, in which we all participate. Our speakers deserve a special thanks. They've shared their time and their preparation and their views with us. Also want to thank Alyssa Welsh for coordinating this program. And our time has expired. Thank you to our audience and have a great day. Bye now.